Today, I want to share with you a new argument for the existence of God that I think is going to be highly influential in the years to come. Here it is. If there is no God, wait for the PowerPoint. If there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? Well, issue settled. That's all we need. Don't worry, I've got some better arguments coming. But when I was your age, I thought the chicken argument was about as rational as Christian faith could be. I thought faith had to be blind. I thought you couldn't give reasons for God. I thought you either had belief or you didn't, and that was the end of the matter. I was dead wrong. And if I could go back in my life and change one thing, if I could change just one thing in my entire life, it would be for someone to have told me earlier how wrong I was. For me, it wasn't until university that I became a Christian, and that was partly because for the first time in my life, I found some friends who shared with me that their faith was rational. It wasn't blind. They had very good reasons for what they believed. Now, admittedly, Christianity asks us to believe some really big claims, some really extraordinary claims. Here are some of them. The entire universe was created by an invisible, immaterial being. That being then intricately designed the universe so that human life would be possible. Then that being came and lived among us as a human person. He died. 3 days later, he literally, physically rose from the grave. And then for weeks afterwards, he appeared to people and hung out with them and spent time with them. Christianity makes some big claims. But here's a phrase I want you to remember today. Criticism without alternative is empty. Criticism without alternative is meaningless. If someone wants to say that your faith is irrational or stupid, you should ask them what they believe instead. You should ask them if they have a better suggestion, if they have a better alternative, and then you can put the alternatives side by side and you can evaluate which one makes more sense of the world that we find ourselves in. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 4 reasons today why I believe in God in addition to the chicken argument. And then I'm going to place these reasons side by side with the alternative beliefs, and then we can have a look and say what makes more sense of the world that we live in. So let me give you 4 reasons, and we can see them. This will just be an easy way to remember them. We can see them by looking back, by looking up, by looking down, and then by looking within. So first, let's look back, all the way back to the beginning of the universe. Now, as Michael mentioned earlier, 100 years ago, scientists would have assumed that the universe didn't have a beginning, that it had just always existed. And one of the most significant advances, developments in science in the last 100 years has been that the majority of scientists have come to believe that the universe has a beginning. And one of the reasons they believe this has to do with fireworks. I tried to get some fireworks in here to really show you, but they wouldn't let me. So this is what we have. So scientists are now able to detect that the universe is actually expanding. It's expanding in all directions, a lot like the way a firework expands. And the picture that results then, if we trace back the expansion, is that the universe began with an utterly dense point, a singularity, and then like a firework, it exploded at the Big Bang. The Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking says this: all the evidence seems to indicate that the universe has not existed forever, but that it had a beginning about 15 billion years ago. This is probably the most remarkable discovery of modern cosmology, yet it is now taken for granted. The universe had a beginning. As a Christian, I think that beginning is explained when I open the first page of my Bible and I read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But if you don't believe in God, what is your alternative? The alternative is to say that the universe just popped into existence for no reason, with no explanation whatsoever. Now, this is a very weird claim. Okay, here's one depiction of it that I read recently. A description of this atheistic claim. The belief that there was once absolutely nothing, and nothing happened to the nothing until the nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything and everywhere. Then a bunch of the exploded everything magically rearranged itself, for no reason whatsoever, into self-replicating bits, which then turned into dinosaurs. Now that's having a bit of fun, but it's also making a reasonable point. Things generally don't just pop into existence and out of existence for no reason whatsoever. None of us have ever seen a table or a tiger or a Michael Ramsden just pop into existence out of nothing. Scary thought. If the universe began to exist, then there must be an explanation for its existence. And the best explanation that I know of is that God created it. The universe is incredibly finely tuned, incredibly designed for life. Let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine that by this point in the talk, you're utterly bored, you're struggling to stay awake, you're praying that the universe will swallow you up into a black hole. And so you take out a deck of cards and you start to play poker with Amy Orr-Ewing. And in the first 12 rounds of poker, Amy gets 12 straight royal flushes. If you've never played poker, that would be like winning the lottery 12 times in a row. What should we think? Who said Amy's cheating? You should be ashamed of yourself. Yes, of course. Amy's cheating. Why? Because even if she's a very honest woman, it's so incredibly unlikely for someone to get 12 straight royal flushes just by chance that someone must be messing with the cards. Now, over the last 35 years or so, what's called the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God, a type of design argument, has suggested that we should come to a similar conclusion with respect to God. The universe we live in could have taken many different forms, infinitely many different forms. And scientists, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, have come to an agreement that there are dozens of features of the universe that had to be precisely the way they are for life to be possible. Not just human life, not just life on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. Let me give you just one example of that. The explosive force of the Big Bang. That explosive force had to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60th of what it actually was in order for any life to be possible anywhere in the universe. In other words, the percentage difference that you could have while still accommodating the possibility of life is a 0 followed by a period, followed by 59 zeros, followed by a 1. If the Big Bang had been even the slightest bit weaker in its force, gravity would have collapsed the universe back in on itself almost immediately, with no time for life to form. If the force of the Big Bang had been even the slightest bit stronger, the universe would have just dispersed into thin air. All we would have got would have been cold, simple molecules. Particles wouldn't have been close enough to each other. We wouldn't have gotten anything like the complex chemistry that's necessary for life. That's just one example, and there are dozens more. One of the experts says that the likelihood of this occurring just by chance could be likened to a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just by chance producing a perfect 747 airplane as it went through. That's the sort of probabilities that we're working with. So the question is, how are we to explain this amazing coincidence? How are we to explain the royal flushes turning up hand after hand throughout the universe? I think we should come to the rational conclusion. The universe is not the result of randomness. Someone ordered the cards. Someone designed the universe. And this is just what the Bible claims. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Okay, we've looked back to the beginning of the universe. We've looked up at the design of the universe. Now I want to look down. And what I want you to see is an empty tomb, a tomb that's empty because Jesus miraculously rose from the dead. Before I was a Christian, I just assumed that there was no way that there could be evidence for such a thing. But when I finally looked into it, I couldn't believe how strong the evidence was. This book was written in 2003 by a colleague of myself and my team's at Oxford. He's widely considered to be the best British philosopher of religion of probably the last 60 years or so. And in this book, he concludes and argues that on the historical evidence today, it is 97% probable that Jesus truly, physically, miraculously rose from the dead. How in the world can he claim that and then have it published by Oxford University Press? There are lots of reasons that we could go into. Let me give you just one. Here's a passage written by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians. I'll read it to you. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. In the last few decades, experts have come to an agreement that this passage, which claims that more than 500 people saw Jesus and spent time with him after he had been crucified, and it says most of whom are still living. I love that line, almost as if to say, go out and ask them yourself. Experts agree now that this passage was actually the first summary of Christian beliefs. It was a type of creed, and it was passed around the early church. And it was in its current form almost immediately by historical standards after the events, probably within just months of the actual events. So it's now agreed by the majority of scholars who are experts in this area that almost immediately after Jesus' crucifixion, there were many people who were utterly convinced that they had spent time with Jesus after his death. And even the threat of torture and murder could not get them to change their minds. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman governor in the first century. He was persecuting that first generation of Christians. And here's something that he wrote. He wrote, I ask them if they are Christians. And if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. Those who walked this earth with Jesus went from mourning the fact that their leaders seemed to have been defeated. Many of them were too scared to even be present at his crucifixion, to then accepting their own torture and deaths by execution rather than deny that Jesus was God. And all they had to do was deny it in word. All they had to do was say, fine, I'm not a Christian, and then go home and continue to worship Jesus in private. But even for their lives, they could not deny him. To that extent were they convinced that Jesus was the God that he claimed to be. What can account for this? How could every one of them be so utterly convinced that this dead man on a cross was actually worth dying for? Okay, it doesn't add up. Something happened. The bare facts of history demand that something extraordinary happened. The Christian response is the miraculous resurrection of Jesus Christ. If someone doesn't want to accept that explanation, then we can remind them that criticism without alternative is empty. If Jesus didn't actually rise, what are the alternative explanations? Could Jesus' resurrection have developed as a legend over time? No. No one takes that theory seriously anymore. Studies show that it takes about 3 generations for a significant amount of legendary development to make its way into a text. And as we've seen, the experts believe that this passage, which already claims the divinity and the appearances and the resurrection of Jesus, was already in its current form within just months of when the events actually took place. There was no time for legends to develop. Could it have been a hallucination? I think the answer is no. Multiple people don't see the same hallucination, let alone 500 people at once. And there were just far too many appearances in far too many places over far too many weeks for that to be plausible. Could it have been a big conspiracy, an elaborate lie? I don't think it could have been. Okay, people lie when they're getting something out of it. Okay, people don't lie when they're being executed and tortured for it. When I first looked into the evidence for the resurrection as an undergraduate at university, I was absolutely shocked with what I found, with where I thought the historical evidence led. And so I arranged meetings with two of my professors. They were two of the top atheist professors in the Princeton religion department. And I went to them and I just put to them, this is where what I'm reading seems to be pointing. Do you have an alternative explanation? One of them told me that they simply weren't interested in the question. The other glanced vaguely in the direction of a hallucination theory, but when pressed, had no substantiation to defend it. The disciples saw something, and it absolutely transformed their lives. It made them into the most courageous, moral followers the world has ever seen. What did they see? Okay, my answer is this: that God has provided confirmation for all by raising Jesus from the dead. I had actually just finished reading a book on some of the evidences for the resurrection when I first decided that I wanted to follow Jesus. I was alone in my university dorm room. It was 122 Jolene Hall. And I closed the back cover of that book, and I just knew in a way that wasn't just the arguments that had been playing around in my mind, but actually my heart was ready as well to accept Jesus and tell him I wanted to follow him. I was alone, but I just exclaimed out loud, "Oh my gosh, this really happened." And it was then that I first prayed to ask Jesus to come into my life and to be a follower of his. And so have you had that moment? Okay, have you had that moment where faith becomes not blind, okay, but the unmistakable reality of what really happened? I admitted at the beginning of this talk that Christianity asks us to believe some incredible things, okay, but criticism without alternative is empty. So let's look at the alternatives. God created the universe, or the universe popped into existence from nothing with no explanation whatsoever. God fine-tuned the universe for life, or life in the universe is the result of pure chance, and the likelihood of that is about as good as a tornado rummaging through a junkyard and producing an airplane. Jesus rose from the dead, or I put a question mark there, because if the resurrection is not our answer to the transformation that occurred in the apostles' lives, then despite 2,000 years of historical research, there is not a single other even remotely plausible explanation for the greatest movement of all time. And that's just 3 reasons that point to God. Okay, with more time, we could look into many more. Amy mentioned the issue of morality a bit earlier. That's one we could talk about. Is God the standard of what is good and evil? Or perhaps the alternative, that we can't even say there's such a thing as good and evil. God provides a standard and a stability to morality that it doesn't seem anything else can. So we've looked back to God's creation of the universe. We've looked up at God's design of the universe. We've looked down at the grave that Jesus rose from. And now finally I want to look in. A friend of mine once said to me, "Vince, do you think that we can know God?" And I quickly responded, "Yeah, sure." And I always remember this moment when he sort of stared at me dead in the eyes. He wasn't satisfied. He said, "No." He said, "Do you think we can really know God?" What he was asking was, do you think that we can know God personally? Okay, do you think we can know God as a father? Do you think we can know God as a friend? Do you think we can know not just about God, things about God, but God himself in relationship? There are many things in life that cannot be known from a distance. Okay, some knowledge requires direct experience of the thing known. Just to give you an example, my wife, Jo, and we recently spent some time in Florence, and we had the privilege of seeing Michelangelo's famous statue of King David. To be honest, it didn't feel like much of a privilege as we waited in the queue for 2 hours while getting rained on to get into the museum, and while Joe and I discussed our difference of opinion about whether it was worth continuing to wait in that line in order to get in. Joe wanted to stay, and I wanted to go, and so we compromised and we stayed. We didn't know whether we should bother to stay because we had already seen this statue countless times in photographs and on television from a distance. But we stayed, and when we saw this statue, when we saw the David in person and up close, we were so grateful that we did. Only then did we know what all the fuss was about. It actually was amazing to see. We knew something by experiencing that piece of artwork firsthand that simply could not be known from a distance. And I think that the same is also true of knowledge of God. Let me tell you a story of someone I met recently who came to know God not just because of the evidence and the arguments, but because she realized that God was personally involved in the details of her life. Because she realized that God wanted her to give up her distance, and to seek relationship with him. I was giving a talk much like this one at the University of Manchester, and I had the talk already prepared, but at lunchtime, I felt that there was something missing. I just had this strong sense that something was missing from the talk. So I went back to where we were staying after lunch. I changed one page and one PowerPoint slide in the talk, and then I went back. That evening at the event, there was a girl, a university student named Alva. She walked in. We started talking to her. She was a Chinese girl. We said, "What's your name?" She said, "Alva." And my friend said, "Oh, that's a really interesting name. What does it mean?" And she said, "It means by grace washed white as snow." And our eyes went wide. And we said, "Are you a Christian?" And she said, "No, not at all. I just chose that as my English name because I like the sound of it." And so we started to explain to her that her name was actually right at the heart of the Christian message, that Jesus loved her so much that he couldn't bear to see her be punished for the things that she had done wrong in her life. And so on the cross where Jesus died, Jesus took our punishment on himself, on our behalf. And as a result, all the bad things that Alva had done, all the bad things that all of us have done are washed away. They're washed white as snow, just like Alva's name. And then my talk started. I had to leave the conversation. I started my talk, and halfway through the talk, I quoted a verse from the Bible, and I put it up on the PowerPoint slide. This was the one slide that had not been in the talk. And that day at lunch, I just had this strong sense, and I believe it was from God, that there was something missing from the talk. And so I went back and I put one slide into a talk that was already finished, and this was the slide. "Though your sins are like scarlet, they will be white as snow." My friend tapped Alva on the shoulder and said, I told you, it's your name." And she was just astonished. At the end of the talk, my friend continued to explain to Alva the love that God has for her, the sacrifice that he made for her. And that night, for the first time, Alva decided she wanted to know God. She wanted to be in a real relationship with him, and she prayed to become a Christian. God beautifully crafted all the details of that day so that he could reach into the heart of that one single girl named Alva. My question for us tonight, this afternoon, is do we know the God who is not just the cause and designer of the universe, but the God who will do whatever it takes to reach you, to reach into your life? Do you know the God who knows absolutely everything about you, the great things, but the sinful and the shameful things as well? And yet he loves you more than you could possibly imagine. Do you know the God who wants nothing more right now than to be in relationship with you? The Christian promise is that you can really know God in the deepest possible way, not just about God, but God himself. You can know God by entering into relationship with him. And the way you do that is the same way that I did that 14 years ago in my dorm room. It's the same way that Tom did that several years ago. It's the same way that Alva did that months ago. Okay, it's by praying simple but sincere words. I'm sorry and thank you. I'm sorry for the times that I've turned my back on you. I'm sorry for the things that I've done wrong. I'm thankful that you didn't give up on me, but that you were willing to do whatever it took, even to make the greatest sacrifice of your own life in order to be with me. And for everyone here today who's able, I would encourage you to pray those words to God. I'm sorry and thank you. And as I finish, I just want to offer that opportunity for anyone who wants to say those things along with me to God today, to pray with me. Now, maybe you've never said those words to God. You've never stepped into a relationship with Jesus, and this is the first time that you'll ever do that. Maybe you've done that at some time in the past, but actually, if you're honest with yourself, you haven't been living close with God. Okay, you haven't been living with him step by step. And if today, this may not be for everyone, but if today, either for the first time, you want to say that to God, I'm sorry and thank you, and I do want to be in relationship with you now and always. Or if that's something that you've said before, but you know you've been far from God, and you want to make a recommitment to him. And I'm just going to offer a short prayer, and you can pray that along with me. So let's just bow our heads and we'll pray. God, we thank you for your awesome and unsurpassable love. And Lord, I thank you for reaching out to each person here today. God, we know there have been times when we've hid from you. We know there have been times when we've done wrong and we've hurt other people. And we are genuinely sorry. And we ask for your forgiveness. Jesus, thank you so much for giving your life for me so that I could be fully forgiven, so that I could be washed white as snow, and so that I could know you in the deepest possible way. And God, I want to follow you. Will you please help me to do that well? I ask you now to come into my life and to remain with me always. Amen.